The spring wind cut through the market square like a knife, carrying with it the mixed scents of manure, tobacco smoke, and roasted chestnuts. But for Mabel, it was not the smell that burned her lungs. It was the shame. Her father's rough hand shoved her forward, forcing her into the dusty center where buyers gathered. "She's strong enough for chores," he barked, his voice brittle with desperation. "A good cook, but she can't bear children. Useless as a wife." The crowd stirred. Men smirked behind whiskered jaws, their laughter spilling like spilt whiskey. Women leaned together, whispering, while children clutched aprons and stared wide-eyed at the girl standing with her face red from humiliation. Mabel's knees trembled. Only months ago, she had been a wife in a modest home, a woman with a future. But when her husband discovered her barren womb, he cast her out without hesitation, delivering her back to the father who saw her as nothing more than wasted cattle. "Please," Mabel's voice cracked, swallowed by the jeers of the crowd. "Please don't. Quiet," her father hissed, pulling her arm as if she were a mule on display. A drunkard shouted from the edge, "Who wants a barren tree? She's worth less than a mule." Laughter followed, cruel and unrelenting. And then, silence. The hush fell sudden, heavy as snowfall. A figure had stepped forward from the ring of spectators. A broad-shouldered man, coat smelling faintly of pine resin, with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to weigh every detail before settling on her. He said nothing. This was Silas Danner, a lumberjack, widower, father of 4. He didn't bargain or mock. He simply studied Mabel with the quiet gravity of a man who had lived too long with loss. The crowd waited, expecting him to sneer, to dismiss her as the others had. Instead, Silas reached into his coat, withdrew a few crumpled bills, and placed them into the father's greedy palm. Gasps rippled. Mabel's father nodded quickly, relieved to be rid of his burden, but Silas said nothing more. He only touched her shoulder gently, guiding her away from the circle of ridicule. For the first time in months, Mabel felt something stir in her chest. Fear, yes, but threaded with something she had thought long dead. Hope. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing carved deep in the forest, its timber walls darkened by rain and years of labor. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the sound of an axe echoed in the distance. This was not a place of refinement or ease. It was a place of survival. Mabel stepped inside hesitantly, clutching her bundle of meager belongings. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and stew simmering low in the hearth. 4 pairs of eyes turned to her at once, wide with curiosity. Why? Children, 2 boys with shaggy hair, a girl clutching a rag doll, and the eldest, barely 12, watching her with suspicion that felt sharper than any blade. Their gazes lingered on her hands, her dress, her nervous posture. None of them spoke. Silas's voice broke the silence. "This is Mabel." His tone was firm but not unkind, as if introducing a fact rather than a guest. "She'll be staying with us." The eldest narrowed his eyes. "Why?" A beat passed. Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply set down the sack of flour he'd carried in, took up the axe leaning against the wall, and stepped outside again. His silence left Mabel to face the judgment of children who had already known loss. The days that followed tested her. Chores seemed endless, hauling, water, chopping vegetables, mending clothes worn thin by work. Her soft hands blistered, her body ached, and every mistake earned her quiet stares from the children who didn't yet trust her. She burned the porridge one morning, spilled the milk another, and the eldest boy muttered under his breath, "She doesn't belong here." Each word stung, reminding her of every rejection she had ever endured. But Mabel did not leave. She rose before dawn, forcing herself to learn, to endure. One evening, after hours of fumbling with needle and thread, she managed to stitch the torn sleeve of the youngest boy's shirt. When she handed it back, expecting mockery, the little girl smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." It was the smallest mercy, but it cracked the wall around her heart. Later that night, when she thought herself alone, Mabel wept quietly by the fire. She wept not for her failures, but for the fragile kindness beginning to grow in a house she had not expected to call her own. And outside, in the darkened yard, Silas watched from the shadows, silent, unreadable, yet unwilling to turn away. The first true trial came in the dead chill of late autumn. A fever crept into the cabin, striking the youngest boy. His skin burned hot as iron fresh from the forge, and his breath rattled with every exhale. The other children hovered in frightened silence, their wide eyes searching for answers Mabel wasn't sure she had. Silas returned from the mill that night, his face drawn and pale when he saw the boy trembling under sweat-soaked blankets. He fetched water, chopped more wood for the fire, and sat beside his son in grim silence. But when Mabel moved to wipe the child's brow, the eldest son bristled. "You'll make it worse," he hissed. "You're not our mother." The words struck hard, but Mabel did not recoil. She pressed the cloth gently against the boy's forehead, her touch steady. "Then let me be his nurse," she whispered. "He needs every hand he can get." Through the long night, she tended the child, cooling his fever, coaxing water between his lips, whispering soft comforts, even as her own eyes grew heavy with exhaustion. By dawn, the fever broke. The boy's breathing softened, his skin cooling to a gentle warmth. Relief settled heavy in the cabin. Silas met her gaze then, his dark eyes unreadable but weighted with something that felt like unspoken thanks. But peace did not last. Days later, Mabel followed Silas into town for supplies. She had hoped for anonymity among the faces of strangers, but fate had other plans. Her ex-husband stood outside the general store, arm wrapped smugly around the waist of his new bride. His laughter carried across the street as his gaze locked on Mabel. "Well, look who it is," he sneered loud enough for others to hear. "Didn't think any man would take you, not when you can't give him what matters." The sting of his words seared her, but before she could turn away, Silas stepped forward. His voice, quiet but thunderous in its weight, silenced the crowd. "She gives what matters," he said. "More than you'll ever know." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The ex-husband's smirk faltered under the steady, unflinching gaze of the lumberjack. Silas didn't raise his fists, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to defend what was his. For the first time, Mabel didn't lower her head. She stood beside him, not as something bought or discarded, but as someone chosen. And in that moment, vindication tasted sweeter than anything she had ever known. Winter settled heavy over the valley, snow clinging to the pines and smoke curling steadily from the cabin's chimney. Life had found a rhythm again, chores, meals, the soft murmur of children's laughter. But danger, like a wolf, always circled near the edges of the frontier. It came one night with the howl of wind and the sudden pounding of fists against the door. The children startled awake, clutching blankets as Silas strode to the entrance, axe still in his grip from splitting wood earlier. When he opened it, the sour smell of whiskey filled the cabin. A man stumbled inside, an outlaw known from the nearby logging camps, eyes wild with drink and resentment. "Danner," he slurred, pointing a jagged finger. "You think you're better than the rest of us? Hiding away with your brood, taking in strays like some holy man?" Mabel stiffened where she stood by the hearth, the children clinging to her skirts. The outlaw's gaze slid toward her, sharp and mocking. "So this is her? The barren one. They say you bought her like livestock." Her heart froze. Shame threatened to break her apart all over again. But before she could speak, Silas stepped forward. "You've had your say," he rumbled, voice low as thunder. "Now leave." The drunkard laughed, spittle spraying. "Or what? You'll cut me down like one of your trees?" He lunged toward Mabel, hand outstretched, and the children screamed. The sound of Silas's axe striking the table cracked through the cabin like lightning. The outlaw froze, breath caught in his throat. Silas's eyes burned, not wild, but steady, unyielding, promising destruction if another step was taken. "You touch her," he said, his voice steady as steel, "and you won't walk out of this cabin." Silence stretched, thick and taut. Finally the outlaw sneered, muttered a curse, and staggered back out into the storm. The door slammed shut behind him, the wind carrying him into darkness. The cabin was still. The children huddled close to Mabel, their small arms wrapping around her waist. She clutched them, her own tears hidden in their hair. Silas placed the axe back on its hook, his shoulders sagging from the weight of restraint. He said nothing, but when his eyes met hers, she saw it, the truth unspoken yet unmistakable. She was no stray, no burden, no shame. She was his. The days after the storm carried a different quiet. Not the heavy, shame-filled silence Mabel once knew, but a softer kind, like the hush of snow blanketing the woods. Something had shifted that night when Silas stood between her and danger. The children felt it too. The eldest boy no longer muttered under his breath. He watched her instead, cautious but thoughtful, as though measuring the truth of what he had seen, the way she clutched his younger brother to her chest, shielding him as though he were her own. One evening, as the winter sun dipped low and painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, Mabel sat by the fire mending socks. The youngest girl climbed into her lap without asking. At first, Mabel froze, waiting for the rejection she had always known. But instead, small arms wrapped around her neck, and a sleepy whisper escaped the child's lips, "Mama." The word caught Mabel's breath, cutting deeper than any insult ever had. Her hands trembled, needles slipping from her fingers. She pressed her face into the girl's hair, tears spilling silently. The others noticed. The eldest's jaw clenched, but this time he didn't turn away. A day later, he brought her a bucket of water from the well without being asked. "For supper," he muttered, though his eyes lingered longer than before. It wasn't a surrender. It was an offering. Silas, ever the man of few words, noticed, too. One night he returned late from the mill, snow dusting his shoulders, and paused in the doorway. Mabel was bent over the table, teaching the children how to shape dough with small hands. Laughter, soft, uncertain at first, echoed through the cabin walls. For a man who had lived with grief like a second skin, the sight struck him still. He did not smile, he almost never did, but something eased in his face. Later, when the children slept, Mabel lingered by the fire. Silas sat across from her, sharpening his axe. The room smelled of pine and smoke, the glow of embers painting his features in bronze. "You've given them more than I ever could," he said at last, voice low. Mabel shook her head. "No, I only did what any woman would." His gaze held, hers, steady and unflinching. "No, you did what their mother would." Her heart ached at the weight of his words. Not pity, not obligation. Recognition. And for the first time, she began to believe this bond between them was no longer duty. It was choice. Spring thaw came late that year. The ground, usually green by April, stayed brittle and gray. Fields yielded little. The garden rose Mabel had sown with such hope lay cracked under the sun, seedlings shriveling before they could take root. By June, neighbors whispered of famine. At the cabin, food grew scarce. Meals shrank to thin broth and stale bread. Silas cut longer hours at the mill, his frame leaner by the day, yet he returned each night with nothing but exhaustion etched across his brow. The children grew restless, their faces thinner, their voices quieter. Mabel refused to give in. Each dawn she rose early, digging stubbornly in the soil, whispering prayers over every seed. She gathered herbs from the forest, trapped rabbits, and boiled pine needles for broth when nothing else remained. Her hands cracked and bled, but she pressed on. The eldest son, once her harshest critic, began working beside her in the fields. He carried water, lifted stones, and one day, when she fell to her knees in despair, he placed his hand on her shoulder. "We'll make it grow, Mama." The word came naturally now, unforced. Her tears that day were not of shame, but of pride. And then life answered. Against all odds, green broke through the parched earth. Tender shoots of beans and potatoes pushed skyward, clinging to life as stubbornly as the woman who had planted them. The children cheered, clapping their small hands, and even Silas, watching from the fence, allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. One evening, after weeks of toil, the two of them stood side by side in the garden, twilight painting the horizon in gold. The rows of seedlings, fragile but alive, stretched before them like proof of their survival. "You saved us," Silas murmured. Mabel shook her head, brushing dirt from her hands. "No, we saved each other." Silas's gaze lingered on her then, not with the guarded distance he had always kept, but with something deeper, something that reached beyond gratitude. He stepped closer, calloused hand brushing hers, hesitant yet steady. The moment hung between them, two lives scarred by loss, bound now by resilience. Mabel's breath caught as his rough fingers laced with hers, and in the hush of the evening, no words were needed. There, among the rows of stubborn green, a vow was made without ceremony, that whatever storms the frontier brought, they would weather them together. Seasons turned like pages in a worn book. The children grew tall and strong, their laughter filling the forest clearing where once there had been only silence. Mabel's garden flourished year after year, its rows stretching wider until neighbors came seeking seeds, advice, and the quiet strength she seemed to carry in her very bones. Time etched lines into Silas's face, but softened his eyes. Where grief had once lived, warmth remained. The cabin, once a shelter of necessity, became a home alive with music, suppers shared, and evenings spent by the fire. Visitors spoke of it as a place where hardship had been met and conquered, where love had made the air itself lighter. The children, now nearly grown, no longer remembered life without her. To them, Mabel was not the woman father brought home. She was Mama. She was the heart. When illness struck, it was her hands they clung to. When victories came, it was her smile they sought first. Years later, when the youngest daughter married beneath the oak tree by the garden, Mabel stood in the glow of lantern light, watching her children dance. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not of sorrow, but of wonder at how far she had come from the day she stumbled into that market square, shamed and discarded. She had been bought like cattle, but here she was, cherished beyond measure. Even in her final years, Mabel refused to yield to frailty. She still walked the rows of her garden, stooping to tend each plant, whispering encouragement into the soil. "Grow strong," she would murmur, as though speaking to herself once more. When she passed, the grief was deep, but not hollow. Silas, gray-haired and stooped, built her a marker at the garden's edge. On it, he carved the words himself, each stroke of his chisel careful, deliberate. "She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." Visitors wept when they read it. Strangers carried the tale beyond the forest, calling it a story of love born not from beauty, nor from blood, but from endurance, courage, and grace. And long after both Silas and Mabel were gone, the cabin remained, the garden still blooming stubbornly against every storm. A living legacy of a woman once deemed barren, who had sown something greater than children. She had sown hope, belonging, and a love that outlived her. Through humiliation, hardship, and storms of the frontier, Mabel found what the world once denied her, a family, a purpose, and a love that outlasted time. Her story reminds us that true legacy isn't written in bloodlines, but in the hearts we touch and the lives we save along the way. If this tale moved you, we invite you to stay with us. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment. Your words breathe life into these memories. Subscribe for more Wild West. Stories of resilience, redemption, and love. Because even in the harshest places, tenderness can endure.